Harper Audio presents The Gift of Failure: How the Best Parents Learn to Let Go So Their Children Can Succeed, by Jessica Lahey. Read by the author. Lacking saber-toothed tigers and precarious cliffs, failure feels like the greatest threat of all. The one danger our children can't afford to encounter in these times of academic pressure and exclusionary admissions. Yet history is filled with stories of extraordinary people, inventors and innovators who learned how to appropriate the gifts of failure to their own advantage, who did not run from it, but stayed in its company long enough to become comfortable amid the jumbled wreckage of their dashed hopes and flawed plans. They learned how to salvage what was working while leaving these plans behind only to regroup and rebuild. As recent MacArthur Fellow and middle school teacher Angela Duckworth has found, the ability to attend to a task and stick to long-term goals is the greatest predictor of success, greater than academic achievement, extracurricular involvement, test scores, and IQ. She calls this grit, and first discovered its power in the classroom while teaching 7th grade math. She left teaching to pursue research on her hunch, and her findings have changed the way educators perceive student potential. Gritty students succeed, and failure strengthens grit like no other crucible. Every time we rescue, hover, or otherwise save our children from a challenge, we send a very clear message: that we believe they are incompetent, incapable, and unworthy of our trust. Further, we teach them to be dependent on us and thereby deny them the very education and competence we are put here on this earth to hand down. But here's the truth. What research has shown over and over again: children whose parents don't allow them to fail are less engaged, less enthusiastic about their education, less motivated, and ultimately less successful than children whose parents support their autonomy. Decades of studies and hundreds of pages of scientific evidence point to one conclusion that sounds crazy, but it absolutely works. If parents back off the pressure and anxiety over grades and achievement and focus on the bigger picture, a love of learning and independent inquiry, grades will improve and test scores will go up. Children of controlling and directive parents are much less able to deal with intellectual and physical challenges than peers who benefit from parents who stand back and allow their children to try and fail and try again. Furthermore, the failure our children experience when we back off and allow them to make their own mistakes is not only a necessary part of learning, it's the very experience that teaches them how to be resilient, capable, creative problem solvers. The United States has been criticized for producing a generation of inflexible thinkers, students who can memorize and regurgitate, but who are incapable of manipulating information in order to answer questions in novel and innovative ways. This is due in part to the fact that our educational system relies on high-stakes standardized testing as a measure of its efficacy, and because today's parents are simply not allowing their child to muck about in the unpleasant, messy experience of failure long enough to come to terms with the shortcomings of Plan A and formulate Plans B, C, D, and E. Lots of kids can ace a test using Plan A, but it's going to be the kid who has tried and failed and regrouped in order to try again with 25 other plans who will create true innovation and change in our world. That kid is not only creative and innovative in his thinking, he is also unafraid to try out new strategies. He will have the courage and resolve to work through thousands of miscalculations as he pursues a working solution. He will be able to regroup in the face of repeated failures And like Thomas Edison, he will learn the lessons inherent in discovering the thousands of ways a light bulb does not work before inventing the one light bulb that does. My flash of insight had been a long time coming. Yes, I'd been uncomfortable with my own overparenting for a while, but I have to credit my students, again, for teaching me what I was too blind to see. Each year, my 8th graders write essays about an experience that has shaped their education. And after much struggle, one of my most tightly wound and anxiety-ridden students handed in the following paragraph. Some people are afraid of heights. Some are afraid of water. I am afraid of failure, which, for the record, is called aticophobia. I am so afraid of failing that I lose focus on what actually matters. Learning. In focusing on the outcome, I lose the value of the actual assignment and deprive myself of learning. She went on to recount all the ways this fear has held her back in school and athletics, but those first few sentences stopped me cold. Her experience as a student, my professional experience with her parents, my own parenting, and my son's fears all came together in her admission. This student's parents are wonderful, kind, and caring, and they never intended to create this sort of fear in their child. And frankly, the fallout would be their own problem to deal with, save for the fact that the private choices parents make that undermine their child's social, academic, and emotional development eventually come in conflict with a teacher's ability to educate their child. Despite the unbridled optimism and energy of the thousands of new teachers who enter the educational workforce every year, the National Education Association reports that 1/3 of these teachers will quit after 3 years, and 46% will be gone within 5 years. According to Ron Clark, the winner of a Disney American Teacher Award, many of these fleeing educators cite issues with parents as one of their main reasons for abandoning the profession. In a 2011 interview with CNN, Clark related an exchange with a principal who had been named the Administrator of the Year in her state, but had chosen to leave education. I screamed, "You can't leave us!" And she quite bluntly replied, "Look, if I get an offer to lead a school system of orphans, I will be all over it. But I just can't deal with parents anymore. They're killing us." I love teaching dearly, but issues with parents have inspired elaborate fantasies in which I abandon the profession forever, move to Alaska, and raise sled dogs. Issues with parents are the stuff of my nightmares. Now that I understand the root cause of parents' fears and worries, I do what I can to convince them that a small blip in their child's journey means so little in the big picture, and can actually serve as a great opportunity to teach their child about resilience. I back up, let those anxious parents slow their breathing, and help them see that they have a fantastic, kind, generous, and curious child. I reassure them that he will be fine. Indeed, he will do wonderful and interesting things in his life, and no one will remember whatever transgression or failure triggered our conference. Some parents believe me, but many more do not, and leave my office convinced that the B- their child received for the semester spells the end of their dreams for educational excellence, economic security, and a lifetime of happiness. It's always been hard to be a teacher, and equally difficult to be a parent, and there should be plenty of common ground for mutual sympathy. We are, after all, working toward a shared goal, the education of our children. Unfortunately, parents who put a priority on saving kids from frustration, and teachers who put a priority on challenging their students often butt heads, and consequently, the parent-teacher partnership has reached a breaking point. Teaching has become a push and pull between opposing forces in which parents want teachers to educate their children with increasing rigor, but reject those rigorous lessons as too hard or too frustrating for their children to endure. Parents rightly feel protective of their children's self-esteem, but teachers too often bear the brunt of parental ire. I've struggled to find the best way to support parents in their efforts to love and nurture their children while teaching them how to step back a bit and allow children the safe space they need in order to fail, particularly when those kids hit middle school. Middle school is prime time for failure, even among kids who have sailed through school up to that point. The combined stressors of puberty, heightened academic expectations, and increased workload are a setup for failure. How parents, teachers, and students work together to overcome those inevitable failures predicts so much about how children will fare in high school, college, and beyond. And that way forward? In order to help children make the most of their education, parents must begin to relinquish control and focus on 3 goals: embracing opportunities to fail, finding ways to learn from that failure, and creating positive home-school relationships. In the chapters to follow, I'll explain each of these goals in depth and give you strategies that will help you achieve them. The day I finally came to terms with my own overparenting, I was determined to start making amends at home with my own children. I needed to do something immediate, something symbolic, and I knew just where to start. My younger son, then a 3rd grader, had never learned to tie his shoes. I blamed this oversight on the invention of Velcro and his preference for slip-on shoes, but if I'm completely honest, I knew I was falling down on the job. He freaked out when I mentioned the situation, even in my most enthusiastic, "Won't this be a fun project we can do together" voice. He got frustrated with my instruction. I got frustrated with his helplessness, and the entire endeavor dissolved into anger and tears. Tears over shoelaces. When I began to look closely at the source of his issue with the shoelaces, it all boiled down to his feelings of frustration and helplessness, which was my fault, not his. I taught him that. For every time I tied his shoes, rather than teach him to do it himself, I reinforced his perception that I believed the task was too hard for him. Eventually, he and I both began to wonder whether he'd ever prevail. One day before school, when he'd left his Velcro shoes at a friend's house and had to wear the backup pair with laces, he said he'd rather wear his rain boots than try to tie his shoes. He didn't even care that wearing boots meant he'd have to sit out PE all by himself. This, right here, is what I had wrought. My son was so convinced of his inability that he was willing to forfeit an hour of playtime with his friends. So that afternoon, I took out his backup sneakers and prepared to remedy the situation. Over a snack, I told him I'd made a mistake and that I thought I'd figured out how to be a better mom. I empathized with his worry and told him that while the task might be hard for him at first, with some effort and perseverance, I knew he could conquer it. I was so confident that we were going to stick with it until he mastered those darn shoelaces. In less than an hour, the embarrassment he'd felt about being the only 3rd grader who could not tie his shoes was gone. He had succeeded, and I've hardly ever seen him so proud of himself. I felt like a supermom, and all it took was a little time, a little faith in each other, and the patience to work through the tangle of knots and loops. No, it's not always going to be this simple. The stakes get higher and the consequences get bigger as our children get older. Lumpy knots and uneven shoelaces give way in the blink of an eye to flawed college essays and botched job interviews, and there's only so much time available to instill confidence and resilience in our children. The work begins the first moment our babies fail to grasp a toy or fall as they toddle across the room, and continues until they head out into their own lives. The sooner parents learn to appreciate the positive aspects of hardship, and allow children to benefit from the upside of failure in childhood, the sooner all of us will have the opportunity to share in the moments of pride like the one I saw on my son's face as he secured those laces. It's up to us. Parents have the power to grant this freedom to fail. Teachers have the ability to transform that failure into an education. And together, we have the potential to nurture a generation of confident, competent adults. Let's get started. Part 1. Failure, a most valuable parenting tool. Chapter 1. How Failure Became a Dirty Word, a brief history of American parenting. As a child, I was obsessed with the Little House on the Prairie books. I wanted to live in a sod dugout on the banks of Plum Creek, or a tiny cabin in the big woods under the strict but loving guidance of Ma and Pa Ingalls. I wanted to be Laura, who bravely roamed the dangerous and exciting world around her and made plenty of mistakes as she made her way across the prairie. When she returned home to face the music, her parents responded not with anxiety and fear, but with interest in her adventures and an eye toward her education in the great big beyond. I strove to be tolerant of my sister, just as Laura was of Carrie. When the extravagant gift I coveted did not appear under our Christmas tree, I reminded myself of the year Laura received only a small tin cup, a piece of candy, a small cake, and a penny, and tried to be grateful. Remnants of my "what would Laura do" mentality survived into adulthood, and I could not wait to read the Little House books to my own children, to teach them about Laura's world of clear-cut morality and balloons made of pig bladders. We read and relived their favorite moments, dribbling syrup on snow to make candy, coloring butter with the juice of grated carrots, and tracing patterns in the window frost with a thimble. I encouraged them to wander our not-so-big woods, even as I worried about bears and hunters and deep cellar holes. I did my best to be that reassuring, firm, and loving Ma for my sons. Ma and Pa set clear limits and goals for their children. Right was right, wrong was wrong, learning arose from failure, and when parents had to discipline, consequences were swift and just. And so, when I became a parent, what would Laura do became what would Ma do, and I strove to raise my children according to that ideal. I try to remember that their mistakes and failures are a necessary and inevitable part of their growing up. The fact that I turned to the late 19th century for advice says a lot about how complex and confusing parenting has become. Ma and Pa understood that the job of a parent is to raise self-sufficient, capable, and ethical adults. I envy their clarity because sometimes I'm not sure what my job is. One day it is to be my son's friend, so he will feel comfortable enough to confide in me. The next, it is to stand firm as an authority figure and teach him to write thank you notes whether he wants to or not. If I'm confused by my role, then he must be too. No wonder I yearn for the simplicity of parenting in the big woods. I fear, however, that even capable Ma and Pa Ingalls would be overwhelmed and confused by the shifting expectations and lack of solid footing in today's parenting landscape. In order to get our bearings in this confusing territory, to understand how we arrived in this state of confusion, we need to find the signal in the noise of our collective parenting history. Parenting in a simpler time. Parenting in colonial New England was simpler in terms of its hierarchy of needs, defined as it was by risk and loss. Parents could expect to lose 1 in every 10 children, even in the healthiest and wealthiest communities. In cities such as Boston, where urban poverty and close living quarters facilitated the spread of disease, childhood deaths were 2 to 3 times higher. When a disaster struck, as it did during the 1677 smallpox epidemic, a fifth of the population died, most of them children. Parents to whom the sight of a dead child was a sight no more surprising than a broken pitcher were preoccupied with basic needs, the daily struggle for shelter, food, and safe drinking water, rather than the education, social life, and emotional health of their children. Reason, rather than emotion, dominated early American child-rearing. The voice of parenting philosophy in colonial America, as far as such a thing existed, was that of John Locke. Where today we explain why it's not nice to bite the neighbor lady via a long-winded treatise accompanied by a supplicatory lollipop, Locke favored a simpler solution, one that stressed clear-headed reason over emotion. For long discourses and philosophical reasonings at best amaze and confound, but do not instruct children. Children were meant to be seen and not heard, and to always behave in the best interest of the family. They certainly were not allowed to make a scene. Toddler temper tantrums in the 1690 equivalent of the grocery store? Please. Locke advises, crying is very often a striving for mastery and an open declaration of their insolence or obstinacy. When they have not the power to obtain their desire, they will by their clamor and sobbing maintain their title and right to it. Emphasis locks, and I can almost hear the derision dripping from those horrid, emotional words. When children faced hardship and the consequences of their mistakes, Locke advised parents, by no means bemoan them. This softens their minds and makes them yield to the little harms that happen to them, whereby they sink deeper into that part which alone feels, and makes larger wounds there than otherwise they would. In other words, correct and comfort, but do not pity or make a big deal out of children's hardship and failures because the many inconveniences this life is exposed to require that we should not be too sensible of every little hurt. Locke was very much in favor of encouraging children to get back up and try again when they failed. In the little harms they suffer from knocks and falls, they should not be pitied for falling, but bid do so again, which, besides that it stops their crying, is a better way to cure their heedlessness and prevent their tumbling another time than either chiding or bemoaning them. But let the hurts they receive be what they will. It will stop their crying, and that will give them more quiet and ease at present and harden them for the future. Again, the emphasis and disdain are Locke's. Colonial parents loved their children, and I'm sure they comforted them when they suffered knocks and falls, but these obstacles were considered a part of daily life as one contributed, quietly and obediently, to the survival of the family in a harsh and dangerous land. Children grew up surrounded by the ups and downs of life, and parents had more to focus on than the happiness of their offspring around the clock. Parents pushed their children out of the nest much earlier in life than we do today. In the words of writer and American revolutionary Thomas Paine, nothing hurts the affections both of parents and children so much as living too closely connected and keeping up the distinction too long. Children married young, had their own children soon after, and had to be ready to maintain their own trade, farms, and households before they left what we consider middle adolescence. So parents were under pressure to pass down an education in survival and independence from a very early age. The American Revolution saw the birth of a new nation and a new philosophy regarding the nature of children and their place in family and society. Just as our nation rebelled against the rule of an English king who required blind allegiance and submission, writers and thinkers promulgated an analogous vision for American children. As Stephen Mintz points out in his book Huck's Raft, A History of American Childhood, this move toward individuality can be illustrated by the concurrent shift in baby naming conventions. Until the American Revolution, children were typically named for parents or a close relative in order to reinforce the significance of lineage and honor for the family over the individual. By the mid-18th century, however, parents began to bestow unique names on their children, sometimes paired with a middle name in an added display of individuality. Other customs that paid service to political, social, and familial hierarchies, such as children bowing to their parents, fell out of favor, and the spirit of revolution began to seep into the minds and habits of a citizenry who refused to view themselves as subjects of any master, political or otherwise. Americans began to look toward the future of their new country, a nation of educated citizens that depended on children who would not bend to tyranny, but value individual rights in service to freedom. Despite the promise and heady idealism of this hard-won American independence, children still lived lives of quiet desperation. Up to half of all children lost a parent before they reached marriageable age, so many carried the weight of their own childhood work, as well as the work of a parent, on their narrow shoulders. Farm children as young as 5 were put to work and expected to do their share in order to secure their family's future. In cities, children had household chores, learned trades, and helped with the piecemeal work families brought into the home in order to earn extra money, such as laundry and sewing. By the end of the 19th century, as the American population and its economy moved away from the farm and toward the city, 1 out of every 6 children between 10 and 15 was employed. Mills and factories employed children because of their handy, compact size. They could squeeze their small bodies under industrial machinery in order to free snags and malfunctions, and they were a cheap and expendable form of labor. The early part of the 20th century marked a new awareness of the danger and horrors children endured in the workforce. Unsafe child labor practices led to the creation of child labor laws that prevented children below a certain age from working outside the home. Just as child labor was outlawed, mandatory school attendance became the law of the land. Children who used to work for the financial security of the family were now occupied with the work of education. These reforms were wonderfully beneficial, but from the perspective of the family and a society that measured a child's worth by his utility, children had become superfluous, and over the course of a generation were transformed from useful to useless, profitable to priceless. As more children were born and raised into a life of leisure, parents were left to cobble together new parenting goals in order to raise these very expensive, non-productive children. The rise of the parenting expert. By the time Parents magazine appeared on newsstands in 1926, the debate over parenting philosophy had taken hold in American culture, and parents were eager for advice and information on how to raise their children in an increasingly confusing century. Thus began the era of the parenting expert, and a temporary lapse in society's faith in the competence of American parents. Where child-rearing had once been absorbed into the fabric of everyday life, it now became a full-time job, requiring expert advice and training. Society no longer viewed children as miniature-sized adults, capable of work and resourceful problem-solving, but vulnerable dependents requiring a great deal of well-researched and precise care. As the number of children per family shrank over the years, parents focused more on the individual child's emotional and psychological needs. All those idle children had time to express their psychological issues, and new theories of developmental psychology emerged to address those issues. Behaviors that would have been described in judgmental terms by John Locke were deemed emotional conditions to be treated rather than irksome behaviors to be corrected. Gone were the days of the sturdy, resilient child. The era of emotionally dependent children and anxious parents was officially underway. Parents heard the message of late 19th and early 20th century experts loud and clear. Mothers had no business raising a child without the advice of doctors. Women used to counsel other women on child rearing, gathering advice in the form of wisdom handed down over generations. But as pediatric medicine emerged as a specialty, the wisdom of generations past was treated with distrust, if not overt disdain. These experts advised women to turn a deaf ear to the grandmother, whose influence is particularly pernicious, as she is supposed by her previous experience to know everything about babies. Before the 20th century, parents, mostly mothers, took care of children's health care needs at home. Mothers kept a medical text, such as William Buchan's Domestic Medicine in the Home, and functioned as doctor, therapist, dentist, and teacher for their own children. At the turn of the century, however, the number of books on child rearing and child care exploded, and more significantly, their tone changed. Parenting had become a field of study, and the experts writing the curriculum for this postgraduate specialty had little faith that mothers could ace it on their own. The 1920s also marked the emergence of professional child care. Nursery schools were increasingly used as a way to educate all those ignorant mothers on the latest scientific advances in parenthood. Dependence on child-rearing books, manuals, pamphlets, and professionals was strongly encouraged, and an avalanche of these publications emerged on the scene. They were full of the advice parents were told they needed about how to keep their children safe from the threat of germs, another popular topic thanks to the discovery of the germ theory in the late 19th century, and attend to their children's ever-changing and newly pressing emotional needs, concerns that would have been laughable to parents just 50 years before. The mental and emotional state of children was a novel concept, and the psychologizing of child-rearing implied that parenting was not instinctual, but a skill to be studied and learned. The consequences of improperly parenting a child included grave psychological damage and emotional distress, leading to psychological syndromes such as sibling rivalry, phobias, sleeping disorders, and teenage rebellion. Freud popularized the theory of psychosexual development and warned parents about the dangers of neuroses due to improper toilet training, heaping the burden of adult psychological illness on improper mothering. Psychologist John Bowlby alerted parents to the grave harm that can result from incomplete attachment to our children. If we did not hold them enough, they would become maladapted juvenile delinquents. Children increasingly became the focus of their parents' lives, and by the time the 50s rolled around, the United States had become fixated on the care, feeding, and entertainment of its young. Full faith and credit in experts persisted until a certain warm and fuzzy physician gave parents permission to trust themselves again. You know more than you think you do. Dr. Benjamin Spock's Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care, published in 1946, sold 750,000 copies in its first year and marked a shift in the tone parenting experts adopted when handing out advice. Dr. Spock's book began with the shocking, yet somehow comforting assurance, "Trust yourself," and "You know more than you think you do." With those introductory sentiments, Dr. Spock handed power back to parents. He hoped to halt our nation's overdependence on experts, and it seemed he might just be the savior of common sense. Women still turned to doctors and psychologists for consultation, but Dr. Spock, through his gentle tone and comprehensive manual, encouraged parents to exercise common sense and ownership of their parenting. While many found Spock's vote of confidence in parents a step back toward sanity, some people, experts who were losing their authority, and parents who were frightened by the sudden lack of direction, found this freedom anxiety-provoking. Vestiges of antiquated theories about the fragility of infants and the lifelong impact of bad parenting decisions remained. So when paired with a new freedom from the inflexible instructions of experts, many parents were paralyzed with the weight of their own power to tragically and irreversibly screw up their kids. As the 50s came to a close, a generation of children bent on rebellion and anti-establishment sentiment gave those experts plenty of ammunition in the case against Dr. Spock's brand of feel-good parenting. The 1960s exploded in bursts of social and political activism, and its children began to believe in the power of a younger generation to change the world. John F. Kennedy, the youngest president ever elected, succeeded the oldest, and the civil rights movement gained energy and momentum thanks to a generation of young activists. They were loud, they were gaining power, and there were simply more of them than ever before. The baby boom following World War II reduced the median age of the American population to less than 20 years old. Adulthood and the responsibility that came with it lost its allure, and power lost its positive connotation as this younger generation was urged to actively question rather than blindly follow authority. Adolescence became a time of rebellion, experimentation, and the search for identity, and as it expanded further and further into what had traditionally been seen as adulthood due to prolonged schooling, delayed marriage, and jobs made scarce in a weak economy, Americans sought to stretch out the endless summer of childhood. Consequently, adults who had been raised in a more authoritarian era, operating under the long-standing assumption that adulthood began at 18, felt increasingly powerless in the face of this rebellion. Many parents put their hands up in defeat, and the media jumped on these parents for their overly permissive child-rearing. Remember, child psychologists still espoused the theory that parents were likely responsible for the misdeeds of their children, particularly if they mucked up their child's infancy, so it made perfect sense that the media blamed parents for the historically unprecedented rebellion of America's children. Permissive parents were labeled neglectful parents, as illustrated in Jules Henry's 1963 study, Culture Against Man, in which Henry pinned the blame for the insolence and insensitivity of America's adolescents on the overly intense child-centered post-war family that produced children who found it difficult to break the umbilical cord during adolescence. In the meantime, the family was falling apart, at least relative to the quickly dwindling nostalgic glow of the 1950s. At the beginning of the 1960s, half of all women married before they were out of their teens, had a couple of kids in the first years of marriage, and remained at home with their children. However, as the decade progressed, young women went to college, got jobs, and put marriage off as they established their place in the world. Divorce rates doubled between 1960 and 1970, and the number of couples living together outside marriage increased sixfold. Older, more independent and confident parents finally settled down to have children, and when they did, they parented according to the attachment method, the natural extension of Spock's trust yourself sentiment. Attachment parenting sought to strengthen the parent-child bond through constant, close contact and nurturance. The idea was that strong bonds established in infancy persist over a lifetime. John Bowlby, Harry Harlow, and T. Barry Brazelton strengthened public sentiment around the importance of attachment parenting. And by the time the American public bore witness to a prime-time broadcast about the tragically neglected children discovered in Romanian orphanages, the theory of attachment parenting had become a dire warning. Wear your children in a sling 24/7 or risk attachment disorder like those Romanian babies. However, this message was incompatible with the reality most parents faced in the 1970s and 1980s. Women flooded the workforce in the wake of the feminist movement and were finally beginning to fulfill and be recognized for their potential as thinkers, innovators, and leaders. More significant, women had to work as inflation soared and recession settled in after the economic expansion of the 1960s. Women were torn between the needs of home and work, children and financial security, attachment parenting, and the psychological need to detach from the restrictive labels of motherhood and expand their rights as individuals. Hence, mothers were fertile ground for seeding the self-esteem movement of the 1970s. Nathaniel Branden's 1969 book, The Psychology of Self-Esteem, kicked the movement off with a bang. His message that self-love is vital to emotional health and that a person's self-evaluation is the single most significant key to his behavior appealed to parents who sought to assuage their guilt and fill the gaping hole left by their own self-esteem-fueled search for self and career-fueled detachment. The individual and her sense of self-worth eclipsed the value of community or family, and the American self-esteem movement took off. Unfortunately, it did not accomplish what Nathaniel Branden hoped. Branden envisioned a world in which children so valued themselves that the opinions of others would bounce off like some self-esteem force field, and we'd all live in a state of blissful self-exploration, self-satisfaction, and self-love. That's not quite how it worked out. Jean Twenge and W. Keith Campbell placed the blame for the narcissism epidemic squarely on the back of the self-esteem movement. According to Twenge and Campbell, the self-esteem movement may have bolstered American self-esteem, but the result is not a happier, healthier citizenry. It is a generation of self-admiring narcissists focused on superficial appearances and personal gain. Worse, the self-esteem movement, with its emphasis on individual happiness, was the final nail in society's distrust of collective action and government. The self-esteem movement promised that we could feel good about ourselves in everything we do, that our kids would always like their parents, and that we would feel great about our parenting all the time. But this is not how life, let alone effective parenting, works. Children who like their parents all the time are not apt to be children who are corrected when they misbehave, called on for their mistakes, or asked to consider the needs of other people. It does not feel good to punish or correct our children. No one wants to be the cause of tears and hurt feelings. It feels great to hand our kids cookies just before dinner with a conspiratorial finger over the lips, bonding us to our kids in a shared secret treat. It feels wonderful to swoop in and rescue when we take that forgotten homework to school, saving our kids from the disappointment of recess detention and the stern glare of a teacher. The catch is that what feels good to us isn't always what is good for our children. We are not used to putting off what feels right and good for us in the short term in order to do what is right and good for our children in the long term. The lure of short-term happiness and permissive feel-good parenting became even more tempting as we heaped on guilt over increasing divorce rates, more hours spent at work, and less time spent in leisure with our children. Treats traded hands in exchange for the quality time we could not spend with our families. When we did have time for them, we wanted to spend it in relative peace, not in squabbling over rules and consequences. It takes more time to teach a child how to clean a toilet than to clean the toilet ourselves, as is the case with about every worthwhile lesson. And we just did not have that kind of time anymore. I'm not casting stones here, and the windows in my glass house are well overdue for a cleaning. My children are quite limited in their ability to cook simply because I want and need that time in my kitchen to myself. It is my refuge from a day spent in the classroom or in doing things for my own children. I'll teach them how to cook someday, just not today. As we move through this new millennium, parents are caught in a bit of a catch-22. We are expected to feel good about ourselves and our parenting as we raise children naturally and intuitively while poring over more parenting books and magazines than ever about how to raise smart and creative and empathetic children who practice piano on their own, sleep 9 hours a night, and play varsity soccer as freshmen. We are expected to take up the mantle of those authoritarian experts we abandoned in the 50s and function as professionals both at home and at work. As we sift through the reams of parenting advice, we are left to strike our own balance between work and home, trust in our instincts, and trust in the experts. Today, parenting is less oxytocin-soaked rosy glow, more adrenaline-fueled oncoming headlight glare. According to a post on Parenting Magazine's website about today's most pressing parenting questions, we parents are concerned with the minutiae of parenting, such as, will I spoil my baby if I pick her up every time she cries? And, my baby does not reach his motor milestones as quickly as other infants do. Should I be worried? While our focus has shifted from matters of life and death to the small details of children's mental, physical, and emotional development, the concluding item on the list exposes the concern at the root of all these parenting details. When we beg for answers to all those other nitpicky, insignificant questions, what we really want to know is, how will I know if I am a good parent? The answer for most of us is found in the moments when parenting feels good. I feel good when my children are safe, warm, and fed, of course. But what really feels good, what makes me feel like an A-plus parent, is when I show my kids I love them by rescuing them from disappointment. Those times when I remember to pick up a book from the library I know my son will like, or when I show up at the last second before a soccer game with a forgotten mouthguard so he can play, reassure me that, yes, you are a good parent today. Most of my adult life has been dedicated to the work of raising my children. And until recently, that meant I spent my life protecting them from failure, all wrapped up in the safety of my loving embrace. But that's not working for us anymore, and it's certainly not working for my students and their families. I was afraid to abandon what felt good, afraid to put my needs aside and expose my children to the parts of life that hurt a little. Afraid that I wouldn't hear my inner, yes, you are a good parent today, anymore. Given that the self-esteem movement is a failure, and doing what feels good has fostered a generation of narcissistic, self-indulgent children unwilling to take risks or cope with consequences, what will work? What parenting practice can help our children acquire the skills, values, and virtues on which a positive sense of self is built? Parenting for autonomy. Parenting for independence and a sense of self born out of real competence, not misguided confidence. Parenting for resilience in the face of mistakes and failures. Parenting for what is right and good in the final tally, not for what feels right and good in the moment. Parenting for tomorrow, not just for today. Chapter 2. Why Parenting for Dependence Doesn't Work. The Power of Intrinsic Motivation. I've known the mother sitting in front of me for years, and we have been through a lot together. I have taught 3 of her children, and I like to think that we've even become friends during our time together. She's a conscientious mother who obviously loves her children with all her heart. I've always been honest with her about their strengths and weaknesses, and I think she trusts me to tell her the truth. But when she hits me with the question that's been bothering her for a while, all I can do is nod and stall for time. Mariana's grades are fine. I'm not worried about that, but she just doesn't seem to love learning anymore. She's absolutely right. I'd noticed the same thing about her daughter the previous 2 or 3 years, and I have an answer right there on the tip of my tongue for what has gone wrong. Yet I'm torn between my responsibility to help Mariana and the knowledge that what I have to say is a truth I'm not sure this mother is ready to hear. The truth, for this parent and so many others, is this. Mariana has sacrificed her natural curiosity and love of learning at the altar of achievement, and it's our fault. Her parents, her teachers, society at large, we are all implicated in this crime against learning. From her first day of school, we pointed her toward that altar and trained her to measure her progress toward that goal by means of points, scores, and awards. We taught her that her potential is tied to her intellect, and her intellect is more important than her character. We taught her to come home proudly bearing A's, championship trophies, and college acceptances, and we inadvertently taught her that we really don't care how she obtains them. We taught her to protect her academic and extracurricular perfection at all costs, and that it's better to quit when things get challenging rather than risk marring that perfect record. Above all else, we taught her to fear failure, and that fear has destroyed her love of learning. I look at this mother with concern on her face, her eager pencil poised to write down my words of wisdom, and struggle to find a gentle way to explain that the daily nagging about points and grades both perpetuates Mariana's dependence on her mother's interventions and teaches her that external rewards are far more important than the effort Mariana invests in her education. Mariana is so concerned with pleasing her parents that the love she used to feel for learning has been crowded out by her craving for their validation. This mother's hovering comes from a place of love, that's clear. She wants the world for her children, and yet the very thing she's doing to encourage the sort of achievement she feels will help them secure happiness and honors may be undermining their future success. Mariana is very smart, and her mother reminds her of that on a daily basis. However, Mariana does not get praised for the diligence and effort she puts into sticking with a hard math problem or a convoluted scientific inquiry. If that answer at the end of the page is wrong, or if she arrives at a dead end in her research, she has failed, no matter what she has learned from her struggle. And contrary to what she may believe, in these more difficult situations, she is learning. She learns to be creative in her problem solving. She learns diligence. She learns self-control and perseverance. But because she is scared to death of failing, she has started to take fewer intellectual risks. She knows that if she tries something challenging or new and fails, that failure will be hard evidence that she's not as smart as everyone keeps telling her she is. Better to be safe. Is that what we want? Kids who get straight A's but hate learning? Kids who achieve academically but are too afraid to take leaps into the unknown? Mariana's mother has been extremely successful in school and business, and she knows the value of that hard work in her own life. Her own mother allowed her to fail and play and learn for the sake of learning, but now that she's parenting her own child, she's lost sight of the value of struggle. She is too worried about Mariana's future achievements to allow her to work through the obstacles in her path. She wants to give Mariana everything, and yet she forgets that the very best experiences of her own childhood likely arose from the thrill of facing challenge, from the moments she lost herself in the trying, and when she failed, trying again to accomplish something all on her own, simply for the adventure and pleasure inherent in learning something new. I know this mom because she's just like me, and telling her the truth is hard, both because I'm afraid she'll get defensive and angry, and because it means I have to cop to all the same mistakes she's made in my own parenting. Maybe it's time to share some truths with her as I figure out where I went astray, and together we can help our kids rediscover their intellectual bravery, enthusiasm for learning, and the resilience they need in order to grow into independent, competent adults. With a little luck, they will look back on their childhood and thank us, not just for our unwavering love, but for our willingness to put their long-term developmental and emotional needs before their short-term happiness.
This is the end of the disc. The audiobook continues on the next disc.